Welcome to the Conversations with CommerceNext podcast. I'm your host, Michael LeBlanc. This podcast is brought to you in conjunction with CommerceNext and presented by Wunderkind. With 80 million registered users globally and growing, Poshmark is a next-generation dynamic retailer and a true force to be reckoned with. For our Season 1 finale of Conversations with CommerceNext, we sit down with Poshmark CMO, Tristan Young, to talk about the company's growth, his leadership style, and how to keep up with the post-COVID consumer. Hear how Stephen is managing his team in Poshmark's new work-from-home structure and his perspective on higher education and work ethic when assessing new candidates for his team. With the unique audience that Poshmark has captured, we're keen to unpack Stephen's strategy towards changing consumer behavior.
One thing I'll say is in my last role at Grubhub, I actually had the benefit of already having a distributed team. I had half my team in New York, half in Chicago, and I had some sprinkled across the country. And so I actually started to already think about back then, what does it mean to be a leader of a distributed team? And really thinking about how do I create, things like, how do I create water cooler moments for my team, even if we're all in different places? How do we bring people together?
Let's listen in now. Stephen, welcome to the Conversation with CommerceNext podcast. How are you doing today?
Good, how are you? It's like a happy Thursday, very excited.
Very good. Now, where are we finding you today? What part of the world are we joining you in?
So it's a very good question. Normally, I am all over the map. I've actually been traveling a lot more for work as of the last 6 to 8 months. But today, actually, you'll find me in San Francisco, where I'm based. I originally lived in New York for 15 years, where I would say I probably spent the majority of my career. And I moved to San Francisco to join Poshmark in 2018. And it's been an exciting journey. I'm so happy not one to just be able to join a company that was right at the brink of sort of growing and blowing up into the marketplace, but two, also to be in a state like California, where I think quality of living and weather is fantastic. So I don't mind that at all.
Well, and of course, I'm joined by my my co-host, co-founder of CommerceNext, Scott Silverman, who coincidentally, Scott, you're obviously not in the CommerceNext headquarters. You look like you're in a hotel room. Where are you?
I'm actually in San Francisco, so I can wave to you, and maybe you'll see me soon.
All right. Well, fantastic. I'm in Toronto, so we're at different ends of the continent, but great to be connected here today. Look, let's just jump right in. You've told us a little bit about yourself and your background. Tell us a little bit more. I mean, you gave us a quick overview, mostly from New York, operated in New York. Tell us about your retail background and how you came to Poshmark and what you do there.
Sure. So what'll be interesting is I wouldn't necessarily have like a typical retail background. Like I think at the highest level, I've always dreamed about being a chief marketing officer. So when I started my career out of college, I went to Penn, specifically I went to the Wharton School, where everyone's very much into finance. I happen to be a few people that's like, I really like marketing. I have a passion for it. I think the element of creativity, data, psychology are all things that I'm incredibly passionate about. And so I started my career working at Puma, the sports company. And from there really evolved into, I would say, vacillating between high tech as well as consumer brands. I've actually spent probably north of 15 years in 3 different high growth companies. One I started as early as employee number 10, which was the second largest web hosting business in the US. Then I joined Seamless before it turned into Grubhub and merged right before it IPO'd in 2014. And then I joined Poshmark, I said, in 2018. But to supplement that, I've also spent some time in some big brands, which include American Express, DirecTV, and Puma. For me, really the navigating between these large, big brands and to these high growth has been about, depending on where in my career, looking for opportunities where either it was a learning experience or it was a high impact experience. And for me, these high growth companies are where I can do a lot of impact. And I take a lot of things that I learned in those big brands and share with them, and then vice versa. And so people always ask, if you could choose again, where would you want to go? It's I honestly don't know. It really depends on the opportunity. It also depends on where I'm in my life in terms of what do I want to learn and what challenges really excite me. And that for me has been I would say the North Stars. And whenever I look at opportunities, if I look at the opportunity and say, oh, I could do this in my sleep, I usually don't want to do it, right? If I look at it, I go, oh, that's kind of scary. I've never done that before. Oh, what's going to happen there? Those are things that I then gravitate toward more and then unpack and peel. Because for me, that has been fundamentally what's been driving me from every opportunity to the next. Brand aside, size of company, outcome opportunity aside, really the challenge and the leadership and the team. And fundamentally, I also think where is there an opportunity where marketing truly is going to be valued, right?
Hmm.
Where marketing has a seat at the table and being able to help shape the company's direction and strategy, how to drive
Right.
adoption of the product or the service, and ultimately how to position the product alongside other competitors or in the market space as a whole.
Well, that's a great background. I mean, it's like you're living at the intersection of technology and direct response and e-commerce and marketing. I mean, it's a really interesting place to live, so to speak, as is, I'm sure, San Francisco. Um, for those perhaps less familiar with Poshmark, and in fact, I often find that even people who are familiar, at least at a high level with Poshmark, don't know all the ins and outs. Tell us a bit about the company, its scope and scale. I see you have job openings, which we'll get to a bit later in places like Sydney and London. And you talked about traveling. So tell us a bit about Poshmark.
So to explain Poshmark a little bit, it's a social marketplace that allows people to sell gently used or brand new items. The company started over 10 years ago, primarily focused on fashion as its category, but has expanded to add beauty, home goods, as well as pets and sneakers. And I would say that the marketplace itself fundamentally defines itself as a social marketplace, meaning it's not just an eBay, but it's not just an Amazon. There's an element where people interact with each other. So if you think about all the actions that you're used to doing on Facebook, on Snapchat, et cetera, a lot of those actions we actually bring into this marketplace and use those as a way for people to drive and make sales. So you can like an item, and that effectively allows us to say like, hey, you've got 50 people who like your product. That's effectively 50 leads. How do you market to them? And how do we give you the tools to help them help sell and move your product? So in some ways, we're allowing sellers and empowering them to sell their own products without having to learn SEO, without having to learn, HTML to build emails. It's really kind of a ability for people to be a casual seller or a power seller. And like I said, we've grown to over 80 million registered users. We're now in over we launched 3 global countries with more on the way. And I think for us, it's a really exciting place because if you think about social commerce, which is the area that we're in, the category we're in, a lot of that is happening now. Like people want to buy, but people also want to engage online. They want to understand a little bit more what they're buying. Instead of buying just from a big brand that's, the letter A or the letter W, people also want to buy from other people. And I think you've probably seen in the last couple of years that idea around sustainability and circularity really blowing up. And I think that's what I saw when I joined, 3 years ago, that this is a space that may not be top of mind right now, but it will be over the next 3 to 8 to 10 years. In the same way that, the analogy I give to people is imagine, 15 years ago, the thought of like living in someone else's couch, someone's home, or using someone else's car was very alien to all of us. And now it's commonplace. It's the same idea that, well, why would I want to buy a gently worn jacket? It's like, well, because instead of buying fast fashion, you're like, I just want something based on the style that matches to what I want. And I don't want to pay full price. So why don't I just buy it on Poshmark and be able to then say, once I'm done with it, resell it back into the fashion ecosystem. So I think it really allows people to, not, like I said, not necessarily own goods, but to be able to still have the goods, but then to contribute back to this element of circularity and sustainability, which I know a lot of our young users absolutely love about the product and the platform.
What I love about it is, as I reflect on what you're discussing, it's this bridging the chasm between pure efficiency and experience in retail, right? On these, sometimes you're at two ends of the spectrum. You're very, very efficient, but the experience is, it is what it is very efficient versus experiential, right? So it sounds like that kind of intersection of those two, and then social media and e-commerce, very interesting. One quick question for you now: do your users ship direct to the customer, or you act as an intermediary? Tell me a little bit about that.
So majority of our sales, it is sellers sending directly to buyers. We do have an authentication business for any item over 500, where we actually have the item shipped to us. We then physically authenticate it and then communicate to both the buyer and seller that yes, we validated this bag. The sneaker is actually legitimate in terms of like all of our guidelines. Do you want it? So there are some moments when we actually are an intermediary when it comes to sort of these higher end products. But for the most part, we allow the sellers and the buyers to interact with each other to make the transaction much more seamless.
Right on.
So I'm really excited to have a chance to sit down and talk with you, Stephen, for a number of reasons. One of them's more on the personal side. I have a teenage daughter. A few years ago, she started selling on Poshmark. She's about to go into college. Now she's really interested in marketing and business. And I credit, that experience on Poshmark partially for that. So I thought that was very cool. But also, you were a speaker at CommerceNext IRL at the end of September. Thank you for being part of that. And you talked a lot about leadership and said some things that really resonated with me. And I wanted to touch on those a bit. And I'll start with when you came into the role as CMO, you mentioned that instead of coming in hot and making a bunch of changes and turning over the team there, you really took time to understand the business and getting to know your team members. And you ended up, I think, really benefiting from the domain knowledge that they had and retaining a lot of people, which in retrospect is even more important given what's going on in the market right now. But maybe you could talk a little bit about that experience and what motivates, senior marketers like to come in, and why would someone come in hot at this point? Yeah, I'd love to hear your point of view there.
Definitely. What I'll say is, like, in my time at American Express, I often saw a lot of leaders after reorgs trying to create, their organizational footprint as fast as possible. Whether it's determining who on the team they liked, didn't like, high potential, low potential. Even if HR handed them an entire sheet of like where people fell into the 9 box, they still have their own opinion. And I think this is born from the fact that people feel that working through others is a lot more work than just working through people that you already know, right? Bringing in your own team, hiring people that you like. And like I said, I don't think either approach is necessarily bad or wrong. I think you always have to look at the culture and say, is this the kind of culture that wants you to turn it over, right? And that's part of the norm. Or is this a culture where, there's a lot of amazing people here. They're bringing in a leader to help unlock some of those people's potential and capabilities and really function more as a coach, less of a transformation leader. And I'll say that I think the reason why people probably sometimes come in hot is a lot of it feels like people want to make that imprint immediately, right? Or they want to feel like they want to add value as quickly as possible, when sometimes adding the value is first assessing what's going on, really getting the depth and understanding like how things truly work before then figuring out where can you step in and actually make those changes. And sometimes those changes can be smaller changes. They don't have to be big wholesale changes. I think to some degree, similarly, not just in the people, I also didn't come in, like I said, not that every CMO does this. It's like, I want to change the brand and have a new agency, retool everything within a year. What I actually was very intentional was that, listen, actually this brand is pretty good. You know what? I think I need to understand a little bit more about the customer base, how things work. And let's put that on the back burner, because also we're about to launch new categories. We're about to launch into another country. I'd like to actually see that play out first, and then raise the brand question. What do we want to be when we grow up? So that the brand strategy really maps to kind of like our future view, not just a changing where we came from. And so if you look at that, it just means to me, my approach is very intentional and very thoughtful. I also benefit of the fact that a fantastic CEO who gave me guidance on this, like, don't try to change too much too quickly, even though that in my mindset, that's what I wanted, but really listening to that and say, okay, well, how do I take that and still be able to say, where do I think change needs to happen so that I can start to drive a bit of an impact? I also think that sometimes people don't realize that, how hard it is to hire, how hard it is to, suddenly upend an entire system. But I do think that every leader comes with that perspective, and some people have to learn it the hard way that coming into what doesn't work, and sometimes it might be necessary. So it really depends, I think, on the organization. It depends a lot on what the leadership or the board sold to you as far as what they need you to do, and you also realizing how much can I really get done. I think that's the other thing is people underestimate how much time things take, right? Whether it's hiring or even changing a system in the process, the level of influence. It's a lot of like not just boulders, it's a lot of small, mid-sized boulders you got to move. At the same time, you're still trying to learn the business. So I don't know if I stumbled upon it. I do know that I spoke to a lot of other people who had been in similar roles and asked them like, what would you have done differently if you could do it all over again? And I consistently heard like, I would have taken a little bit more time. I would have thought about it a little bit more, because I think everyone comes in wanting, to fill their egos like, oh, I'm the big cheese. I've got to make this change, instead of saying, actually, let me first figure out how I want to interact in this organization and what's the right way for me to actually drive that change. Is it from the front? Is it from the back? Is it from the side?
I mean, I understand, maybe there are some situations where coming in hot makes sense, but I just feel like we're moving in a direction where your approach, and I kind of see it as just like humble leadership, is one that is going to pay the best dividends in the future. And I'm a big believer in the importance of leadership. I think there's a lot of things that we talk about at CommerceNext, and we get into the weeds a lot, but none of it can get done without strong leadership and
Mhm.
servant leadership.
Yep.
I wanted kind of continuing along this thread of leadership. You spent more than half of your tenure at Poshmark in this work from home environment, and you even went through an IPO
Middle
during
of it.
COVID. And
Yeah.
so, how have you adapted your management style to work from home? What's been working, and what do you think others should be thinking about?
It's a great question. One thing I'll say is in my last role at Grubhub, I actually had the benefit of already having a distributed team. I had half my team in New York, half in Chicago, and I had some sprinkled across the country. And so I actually started to already think about back then, what does it mean to be a leader of a distributed team? And really thinking about how do I create, things like how do I create water cooler moments for my team, even if we're all in different places? How do we bring people together and use, Zoom or Blue Jeans to create shared experiences? And so in some sense, I actually went back to that playbook that I had at Grubhub and said, oh my gosh, actually, I know how to do this and sort of transport it and still make some changes, right? Because I do think that everyone being distributed is very different than half the team in Chicago, half the team in New York. So that when I go to each office, I can still see a whole team, spend time with them, connect, understand, get the lay of the land. Here, it's very, very hard. So I think one thing I've had to realize is my ability to connect with everyone's going to be much more limited. I can't do one-on-ones with everyone. So how do I find ways to either do more joint, one-on-ones with teams or sub-teams? Two, how do I leverage other people to say, what's going on with that team? What's going on with those individuals? How are they feeling? Really trying to dig deeper into not just how are you feeling, but how are people around you feeling? And connecting the stories about what I hear from different people to say, oh, there's an area where this individual might need some more support. He or she may not raise their hand, but other people are clearly seeing it. Can I use that as a reason to double click into this and say, how do we support it? Because everyone's kind of outside, out of mind, right? And it's a little bit hard. I think I've also had to think through how do I connect with the team in a way that's a bit more, I would say this, automated. So whether it's an anniversary or a birthday, can we make sure that I'm still connecting with them and showing my appreciation for their work? And then finally, I think for me, realizing also that a lot of me being a strong leader is understanding what's going to work for me in this new world. We are all like, I'm used to being in meetings all day, but at the same time, it's also incredibly exhausting for me to be constantly on the screen talking. So even changing my style to maybe I don't always use Zoom, maybe I take phone calls, maybe I might do it in off hours and tell people it's like, I also need to have a break, right? And then also, most importantly, I would say being vulnerable at how I feel. I mean, there was a time I would tell you that I told everyone's like, look, y'all, I'm feeling burned out. Like, I'm exhausted. I know how you're feeling. And I think just people hearing that I'm burned out makes them feel like, oh, everyone's feeling it, right? And I said, look, here's what I did. Here's what I changed. And I was sharing the story the other day that, I found recently, and I think I was like 6, 7, 8 months ago, that Monday afternoons were just terrible for me. I don't know, but I had to listen to my body. Like, I wasn't very good at meetings. I often would just like not be present. And I realized maybe there's something about Monday afternoons that doesn't work for me. So how do we clear that afternoon? Give me some breathing space so that I can be my best and be 150% for Tuesday through Thursday, right? And it's really listening to your body, not pushing yourself, because for anyone that's a high achiever, like I said, a lot of my team is I myself, you just want to get more done and there's no end, right? You can keep working all you want, but eventually our body keeps score and tells us, I don't want to do any more work. And I think that was me listening and saying, my body doesn't want to do any work right now. I don't know why. And saying, it's okay, right? I'd rather have high quality output in the times that matter than try to like slog it all through. So I think sharing those experiences with my team and makes also a change in management style when we're so used to always coming from a position of strength, that I think showing a little bit more of that vulnerability and how this entire environment has impacted us, how we feel, like allows you to connect your team a little better. And look, there's so many more things I could do, but there's only so much time in the day. And I do feel that appreciation, recognition, vulnerability are 3 of the things that I really had to highlight a lot more during this time in order to be able to connect with my team and to try to retain as many of them, even as I'm asking for even more productivity.
What about creativity? I mean, this concept of coming up with new ideas, people building on an idea, riffing. If this is going to the work from home going to be a long-term type of situation, how do you feel like your ability as a CMO to nourish that creativity on a long-term basis?
I will definitely say it's one of the areas that I think we're the most hampered. Like the ability to riff in person and to feel each other's energy and to build on that is so much easier in person. Now, it doesn't mean you can't do it. Whenever we've had to do brainstorms, it's like, it sounds awful. We have to do structured brainstorms, right? Which is almost antithetical to how you talk about it. Like you come in with your ideas and then we sort of, vet the ideas against each other versus asking an open space, like, what do you think we should do? I don't think, unless you're in the design space where there are tools that allow you to have this creativity flourish online, I think it's harder for those of us who are probably in the more business analytical to then suddenly be creative when we're facing a screen. I know that anytime we do any brand discussions, strategy discussions around positioning, it is so difficult to do it on Zoom, right? You're cutting each other off. You're not able to build. So I'm hoping that the virtual workplace, the hybrid, where we can maybe say, hey, there's sometimes we want to come in because we want to riff on each other. Let's use that one time of the week to do that. And maybe other times are basically heads down, you're doing your own work. And can we come to a place where, like I said, it's going to be a virtual hybrid workplace that we just leverage the time together for the things that we know works best for that, right? Versus I think before we almost had like a one size fits all, that we assume that everyone can be, working at the same pace and brainstorming at the same pace. So I think that's a new mode, that new muscle memory that we're all learning. And I'm excited that we're all at least in a mindset of being able to change the rhythm and not just be on the screen 5 hours a day, 10 hours a day, 5 days a week, but really change it up. Maybe go to the office, do a half day. And so I've been doing that with my team. Well, maybe I'll do a half day, or I'll do spend 3 hours someplace else on a project that requires a bit more of a discussion.
Yeah, it's a really interesting time. And I think everybody's experimenting, trying to find the right balance. I know, Michael, you wanted to go a little bit into kind of hiring for marketing talent.
Yeah, the question is, you've got a fantastic pedigree, a top tier university. Is that what you look for? I hear from other leaders that they find, other business leaders, that the education system is almost failing them in some ways, and they look for other types of certification, not necessarily colleges or universities, but there's many different types of education that they have a broader lens. Is that how you look at things, or tell me about that when you're looking for talent?
So my framework for talent fundamentally, and it applies to a lot of levels, maybe except for VPs, right? Is I like to look for people who are, and you've heard this before, they're generally all around athletes, right? They can do a lot of different things, but it's hard to define that in the context of education. So what I look for are people who I have like high will, medium skill, right? And that the idea is that a lot of the skills for these roles are usually on the job training, and they change every 6 to 18 months, right? So someone who has high will and has demonstrated in either prior work or in school projects or in dedication to like public service or school entrepreneurial like sports clubs, to me are the kinds of candidates I like. Now, obviously, you look at different schools, and I try not to have what I call looking glass bias, like that just because this person went to a school of a certain level that I am used to or that I've gone to, that they're all going to be exactly the same. I recognize that people come in with different biases, different experiences, right, different life experiences. So usually to me, the school might get you through the door, but it doesn't guarantee you the job. So someone who didn't go to that kind of a school, but has clearly done their homework, is emotionally intelligent in the interview, to me skews a lot higher in the long run. And usually what I try to do is I try to, with my team, obviously we have a panel, I try to be more that voice of, here's my bet on this person, I think they're going to do really well, versus looking at them purely on the functional area. Because I think that's something where a lot of my team members are very good at that. I try to be like, what is the secret sauce of this person? Like, is there something about them that I think they're going to grow into? Is there potential there? And that's hard to assess when you're trying to figure out, is this someone I can work with on a day-to-day? But as a leader, looking at potential, looking at where they came from, looking at what I can unlock is to me the most exciting part, because when you find those, it is an amazing journey to watch someone grow into the role and exceed your expectations. And I've seen that so many times. I actually have this great story where it's an employee that I remember I hired, and, the interview process was pretty tough, but she went through it. And I would say in the first 3-4 months, I saw this look of paralysis on her face every time we would do anything super technical or maybe super mathematical. And I could sense that, she was coming from a place of fear. And so instead of saying, did I mistake on this? I actually had a chat with her and it's like, hey, can I commit to, let's work on this together? Because I actually think you can do this, because you actually answered one of my questions, which was a very technical question in the interview very well. But she needed the permission to actually start from scratch and say, here's what I don't know. Here's what I need to work on. And she put it in, and she ended up being like one of the best people on the team, right? So I think sometimes the things that people have potential on may not be evident, but if you can see it and then figure out how to nurture it, that pays off in the long run. Whereas some people who you think, oh my God, they have all the pedigree, but then also they don't have the will. I said the only people who could really get away with low will and high skill are like engineers, right? Because every hour, their hourly contribution is high leverage. But for others, especially in the knowledge-based work, it's a little bit different.
I love that framework, the medium skill, high will. I love that framework. It's a very visual 4-quadrant box to me to kind of put it into a framework. I want to spend a couple of minutes, shift gears a little bit. I want to spend a couple of minutes on the consumer. Roger Martin, talking about a retail strategist, he talks about consumer behaviors as decaying assets on the balance sheet. This was even pre-COVID. I mean, I don't want to dwell on the COVID era too much, but how are you thinking about behavioral changes of the past that are brought on by the past, the COVID era? Are you thinking that there's been a not just a temporary adjustment in our lives, but are you observing any permanent shifts in consumer behavior from your perspective?
I think the shift is that it's always changing, right? Like I'll give you the example that even last year, right when COVID hit, we had our strategy on how we buy our TV media. But even then, we quickly had to pivot and say, well, for the next 3 months, what are people really going to be watching? Are they going to be watching the travel channel? Or are they going to be watching the news? And then thinking through, like, what is the consumer behavior right now that we need to sort of follow or chase, not necessarily the ones that we think is happening. So to me, the other data point from last year is that, most people were focused on mobile advertising. Then suddenly everyone was at home and suddenly on your desktop. And that shifted also then how people consume media and advertisement. So I just think right now, given that we're still in a landscape where we're not back on the same page from where we were in 2019, consumer behavior is almost not unpredictable, but it is ever changing. And so I think as marketers, we just have to think through logically, if we want to do campaigns, like what makes sense, right? Like if you were an advertiser trying to launch a transport, subway ads in the middle of COVID, I'd be like, what are you doing? Right. But that's not thinking like of what's happening right now. So I do think that every marketer is going to be required to think in that lens of what do I think should happen versus what I think is actually happening. Is there any data to support that? 2, how do you also think about where consumers are going to and how their behaviors are changing in terms of what they believe and what they don't believe? I think a lot of brands probably let a lot of consumers down this past year. Obviously, social justice become a much more important topic. And so also, how do you show up in the most authentic way without being overstretched, without overextending yourself? So I think one, consumer behavior, consumer expectations on the brand. But I think more importantly, just really thinking also about like that all the things that we know about measurement and tracking are also going to be fundamentally changing. So you may actually have to be in a space in the future where you're trying to predict people's behaviors, not necessarily on bits and bytes and pixels and like cookies, but really like what do we think is happening from survey data, which by the way is we're kind of back to the old days of like 50% of
first party data. Yeah.
I just know which
50%. Right.
So it's really interesting to see that shift, and so I do think that measurement will the lack of measurement or the increasing privacy will fundamentally change also how we think about marketing, advertisement, and investments, but also how we think about measurement.
Now, as you think about 2022, because it's right around the corner, is there any big bets you're making that you've intuited around consumer behavior? I talk to some leaders who say, I'm going to pivot more towards influencer marketing or more towards some other things based on what I assume is, let's call it post-COVID, but in the, whatever happens in 2022, we're all putting in our budgets for next year. We're going to have to make some decisions and some bets. Any that jump to your mind?
So I wish I could share that, but then that would be like my secret sauce with the team. Okay. So I probably won't disclose any of that. But I do think that, really making and thinking about measurement and how much do we want to believe and what are belief systems is really going to be one of the top of mind discussion points. Because if there are opportunities to invest but don't have this clear measurement, what do we need to believe in order to go in that direction?
That North Star, you called it like that North Star, right? Just
exactly. Or I wouldn't even say, for most of these things, especially for marketing channels, it's hard to have a North Star unless you've done it in the past, right? You almost have to have a belief that like, I know this works. I have to just try it out with you and see it. And even if the data doesn't show it, I know it's going to work. So how do we think about those kinds of bets based on what you know? And I hate to say it, but based on what your gut and instinct say as a marketer. And also, when do you not believe the data, right? I saw this really amazing article recently about performance marketing, and it was actually saying it's all performance marketing, basically a scam. And if you actually read the article, it actually was quite logical in its approach. But I don't know if I believed all points of it. It basically was saying also that, thinking more strategically in big bets when it comes to channels, things that you probably would never have thought about, that are analog, might be something that everyone has to think about going into 2022. So money's still there. The question is, do you spend it in a crowded ecosystem without any control of the auction or your ability to influence that, or do you try to carve out new tests to diversify your investments? I think people are probably going to be more in the latter, and you already saw that happening in the last 6-7 months.
So we're going to ask you to kind of stretch out your thinking all the way to 2026, 5 years from now. And, you talked a little bit about kind of where you see things happening with the consumer, but what about your role as CMO? How will things be different in 5 years? Are you just managing algorithms? I'm guessing the answer is no. There's a lot more to it, but how do you see your day-to-day being different in the future, 5 years from now?
So I do think that understanding how algorithms work and what its role is in your marketing strategy is still going to be a big part of it. So there, in the absence of even more nose level data, I think algorithms will help us figure out how to optimize our dollars even better. I do think there's going to have to be a lot more time spent, and also how to come up with more big breakthrough ideas that really probably are more traditional, like more at the brand level. Like, how do you create that emotional connection with consumers, especially consumers who demand more when it comes to, social justice positioning, sustainability. And these are things that we probably have taken for granted, but are now becoming more forefront, especially with Gen Z and Gen Alpha. So I think thinking through those, and 3, really also understand, like, how do you work with a team that might be more distributed than ever before. And, I also think the other changing landscape is, what's the role of agencies, right? Are they an extension of your team as a capability, or are they really the ones that are going to come through with breakthrough ideas, or are they actually your, managing your paid media? Because right now, all that's becoming highly commoditized. If you're in the art creative space, think about how easy it is to create your own video, right? Think how it is, like, Canva's changed the entire landscape on how to create ads. A lot of creatives are going to be in a position where it's like, well, what do I do if people can do this themselves? So I think there's a lot there where creation of content and creativity might get more in-house just because of all these tools that are available. And so then with that, how do you then manage that creative process and that big picture thinking? So I don't know if I answered it, but I do think that the role of the chief marketing officer continues to evolve, right? That it's not just a brand role, it's not just a performance role, it's not just a revenue role, it's a little bit of everything. And actually, I remember reading this great article that I think next to the CEO is probably the next most complicated role, right? Because you touch so many things. It's not like when you're in finance, your span of influence is much more narrow, or you're in operations, it's a little bit more narrow. But here it's like, one day it's a comm strategy, the next minute it's a product marketing strategy, the next thing you know, it's tracking and mobile tracking. It, like, you're just jumping around. And by the way, that's what I love about this job, because I exist in all these spaces that I've never been a one person. I think it was probably my SAT score that indicated that I'd literally taken it so many times. I had a split score on both my verbal and math. So I was never, it's like, well, I'm not really good in one or the other. Apparently I'm just okay on both, is how I thought about it. But now it actually means that I can jump into different conversations based on my interest level, and say, do we want to talk about a data question, or do we want to talk about a measurement? Do we want to talk about a creativity? Being able to pivot through all these things, I think, is what the chief marketing officer of the future needs to be.
You gave us a couple of really good things to think about: the role of the agency and this democratization of creativity. I think there's those are whole topics we could go into more. So you have been so generous with your time. We want to give back, and tell us about the open roles you have, and how can people learn more about them and have an opportunity to work with an amazing, humble leader like yourself.
Thank you. No, so we have a number of roles that are open. I think several of them include, I'm actually looking for an associate brand director role, because we're, like I said, now is the time for me to help think about how do I want this brand to evolve over the next 3 to 5 years. And really having a leader who's worked with other brands to help shape this for us is one of the most important roles right now that I'm trying to search for on the team. I also have a role around retention and CRM, because I do think that as front-end marketing costs become more expensive, really thinking about how to retain your users. And like I said, it's less on just loyalty, but it's really thinking through the fact that how you communicate to users have so many more lens, right? There's push notification, there's email, there's text, there's offline, there's online. How, finding someone who's excited by that. And fundamentally, I think of it sometimes as a database marketing role, but also there's an element of creativity, because the goal is like, how do you get to the consumer and get the right message at the right time? I also have a number of roles opening up on different areas like on merchandising and product marketing, as well as on my growth team, where we continue to sort of invest not just marketing dollars in the US, but globally. So, I'm very fortunate. Like I said, this past year alone, probably we've been able to bring in north of 20 plus new people on the team, which, by the way, in an incredibly difficult hiring year, I give such kudos to our hiring team to be able to identify, get it through the pipeline, and then get it through. Because like I said, it's a war for talent, y'all. We got to be fast on this. I mean, I wish we were even faster, but I know there's sometimes we want to make sure that we don't miss the right things on certain employees. But for me, these kinds of roles also indicate just what we need now. But I do know that we're going to need even more as we grow into a global marketing team, where like language capabilities will come into play in the future. Localization, we also have a huge event component to our business, and how do we localize all of that in a high touch way? And so to me, building out that community is one of the most exciting parts. And then we also have some roles in that. So like I said, my whole team has a lot of different open roles. But to me, if you're excited about working in a marketing team that's very data oriented, that still like holds on to an element of creativity, that serves a really large, passionate community, and that also has an amazing set of leaders. Like I said, I'm the leader, but I will tell you that the leaders on my team are fantastic. Like I am so proud of how all of them have grown. And even from when I start, often I have to paint to them. It's like, remember when I first started? Remember we talked about this problem? Remember how you think about how you're solving it now? And to me, that's great. Like that's me empowering them and training them so that they can do it on their own. Like I always make it that I don't want to be the bottleneck for everything, right? Like bring me in certain parts, but other areas I don't need to. But if you can train your team, then you're functioning the way you're supposed to. And that also for me is a big part of the management style, that I think having distributed teams where I don't see people all the time, but I focus on output is a big was a big plus for me going into COVID, because I had that already before my last role, right? I couldn't see half my team half the month, but I knew they were delivering, and you create that element of trust, and you have to create the systems to say, how do you make sure that people are doing what they're supposed to, or how do you ensure that the output is where you want it to be without having to say, I need an update every day, right? Because I think that I definitely don't need.
All right, and so where do people go?
Just go to poshmark.com/careers. You can see a number of the roles on there. And like I said, if you are interested, let me know. But I would love to have people who are interested in being in a dynamic team, being in a company that also helps people. Our sellers themselves are people who are selling on Poshmark to make a living. And when you meet them and you hear their stories, I have to tell you, it's like amazing. And, I'm very fortunate that in some sense I get to have a for-profit job with a non-for-profit feel, which is what everyone wants. And I think once people realize that, it makes working at this company even more meaningful, that the day-to-day, we're making money, we're selling, but people's lives are actually changing because of the platform that we have. And that makes working there every day so much more meaningful.
Well, Stephen, it's been a pleasure talking to you about marketing and leadership. I can't think of a better advertisement for come to work for Poshmark than to hear you talk about the way you approach things. So thank you so much for being a part of Conversations with CommerceNext. And Michael, thanks for being a part of this as well.
Yeah, my pleasure. It's great listening to you. I mean, leadership for the future, lots of lessons to be learned. And I wish you continued success, Stephen.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. I really appreciate it. And like I said, as you can tell, I love sharing these stories. I also hope that it's something that people can learn from. It's just amazing how I always think leadership is about stories, right? And storytelling and pattern recognizing when say moments, because then that to me feels more impactful when you want to change behavior, sharing either your own experience with it or how it's happened in your life versus saying, here's what you must do because the book says so. I always think that that's the worst kind of like leadership and management.
Right on. Well, thanks again for joining us. And again, wish you continued success. And Scott, safe travels back home.
Thank you.